Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlour of the George at Debenham, the undertaker and the landlord and Fettes and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fettes was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlour at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things, of course, in Debenham. He had some vague, radical opinions and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasise with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us, there was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What's his name?" "Dr. Macfarlane," said the landlord. Fettes was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly fuddled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him. But at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name, Macfarlane, twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion the second. "Yeah," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe Macfarlane." Fettes became instantly sober. His eyes awoke. His voice became clear, loud and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I'm afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe Macfarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, it cannot be, he added, "and yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" asked the undertaker with a gasp. "God forbid," was the reply, "and yet the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy too. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair's white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older, but," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and a good digestion. Conscience, hear me speak. You would think I was some good, old, decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he'd stood in my shoes, but the brains," with a rattling fillip on his bald head, "the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions." "If you know this doctor," I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, "I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fettes paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision, "I must see him, face to face." There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlour to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a Turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent, but this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fettes walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. Macfarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but that he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration, and it was a surprising contrast to see our parlour sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "Macfarlane," he said, somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy Macfarlane," repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of a scare, and then, in a startled whisper, "Fettes," he said. "You?" "Aye," said the other, "me. Did you think I was deed too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush," exclaimed the doctor. "Hush, hush, this meeting is so unexpected. I can see you're unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess at first, but I'm overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present it must be how do you do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fettes. I feel you are out at elbows, but we must see to that for Old Lang Syne, as we once sang at suppers." "Money," cried Fettes, "money from you. The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it, in the rain." Dr. Macfarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. "My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however." "I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you," interrupted the other. "I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if, after all, there were a God. I now know that there is none. Begone." He still stood in the middle of the rug between the stair and doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlour, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fettes clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper and yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and with his hands over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. Before it occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of its passage. Next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the barroom window, and Fettes at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fettes," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you've been saying." Fettes turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face. "See if you can hold your tongue," said he. "That man, Macfarlane, is no safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth, under the lamp of the hotel, into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlour, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles. And as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for its own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favoured and pleased by his exterior. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of anatomy whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K, who was then at the top of his vogue, he enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly illusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hand still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber to repair the abuses of the night and refresh himself for the labours of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions, cold, light, and selfish in the last resort. He had that modicum of prudence miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. "They bring the body and we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo, and again, and somewhat profanely, "Ask no questions," he would tell his assistants, "for conscience' sake." There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror, but the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was, in itself, an offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fettes, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn. And putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fettes, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty," he cried, "that is Jane Galbraith." The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men, but the other looked Fettes darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he'd made, considering soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe Macfarlane, a high favourite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had travelled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skilful on the ice or the links with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fettes he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in Macfarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning, Macfarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fettes heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. Macfarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what shall I do?" asked Fettes. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything? Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognise her," objected Fettes. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said Macfarlane, "and if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud, and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered." "Macfarlane!" cried Fettes. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know, and I'm as sorry as you are that this should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing for me is not to recognise it, and," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy, that is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fettes. He agreed to imitate Macfarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognise her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fettes dropped into a popular tavern and found Macfarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realised in his manners, for he proved, upon a nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over Macfarlane, issued orders like the great Bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fettes on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honoured him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a 10th part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but MacFarlane is the boy. Toddy MacFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh, yes, Toddy, you do." "Don't you call me that confounded name," growled MacFarlane. "Hear him. Did you ever see the lads play knife? He'd like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fettes. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." MacFarlane looked up sharply, as though this jest was scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fettes to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was done, commanded MacFarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. MacFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fettes, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day, MacFarlane was absent from the class, and Fettes smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere, so returned early to his rooms, went early to bed, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 a.m, he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find MacFarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But MacFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, MacFarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You had better look at the face," said he in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fettes only stared at him in wonder. "But where and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fettes was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was too cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death and naked on that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke even in the thoughtless Fettes some of the terrors of conscience. It was a cras tibi which re-echoed in his soul. That two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was MacFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now, Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fettes found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, on every possible account you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if all were right. Where does old K keep his money? There, answered Fettes hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. Give me the key then, said the other calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. Macfarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and the paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in a drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. Now look here, he said. There is the payment made. First proof of your good faith. First step to your security. You have now to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil. The next few seconds were for Fettes an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors, it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with Macfarlane. He set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. And now, said Macfarlane, it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket, I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend. Macfarlane, began Fettes still somewhat hoarsely, I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you. To oblige me? Cried Wolfe. Oh, come. You did, as near as I can see in the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defence. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray is the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked. A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. My God, he cried, but what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant, in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position, Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now? My dear fellow, said Macfarlane, what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay, my dear fellow. You're clever, you have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt, and I tell you, upon my honour and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce. And with that, Macfarlane took his departure and drove off up the Wynd in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fettes was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of Macfarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Gray were dealt out to one and to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head. and before the hour of freedom rang, Fettes trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day, MacFarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he had made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, MacFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fettes had outlived his terrors and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back upon these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and MacFarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial, but it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fettes whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K was again short of subjects. Pupils were eager, and it was a part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glen Corse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then as now upon a crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighbouring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind in mountainous old chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use a byname of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighbourhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fettes and MacFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years and been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried dead and naked to that faraway city that she had always honoured with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon, the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Pennycook, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fishers' tryst, to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whisky with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the two young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon Macfarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said. "Between friends, these little damned accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights." Fettes pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded Macfarlane. "A man! I tell you, it required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the damned thing, but not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fettes thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. Macfarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in this boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang, that's practical, but for all cant, Macfarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities. They may frighten boys, but men of the world, like you and me, despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey." It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction till they were clear of the last houses of the town. Then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course, and followed a by-road toward Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage, and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there, a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was at foot-pace and almost groping that they picked their way through that resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighbourhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illumine one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees, and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labours. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, Macfarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped the better to illuminate their labours against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at an end of their abhorred task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig, one mounted to keep its place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along the wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. Here was a faint diffused radiancy which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with the greater haste, and the process, natural although it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. MacFarlane made some ill-favoured jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips and was allowed to drop in silence. Still, their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fettes. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," said he, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sake, let's have a light." Seemingly, MacFarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no further than the crossroad down at Auchenclinny. The rain still poured as though the deluge were returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify and shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had along with them. The rain had moulded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modelled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time MacFarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet about the body and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fettes. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said MacFarlane, in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fettes. "Hold that lamp," said the other. I must see her face." And as Fettes took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-moulded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leaped from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished. And the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it, sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected grey.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
That was The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I don't know why I haven't done that before, because I do like that story. I like Robert Louis Stevenson, in fact. And I don't know if you've heard my version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I really enjoyed doing. So go and listen to that if you haven't heard it already. It was a lot of fun. I find sometimes that there are stories, usually longer stories, and I don't know if that's significant, that don't get the love that is proportionate to the enjoyment I got out of doing them. That might be just a thing. If you have seen movies of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and TV reworkings, it's not as good. They are not as good as the original. Same's true for Phantom of the Opera. If you think, oh, I've seen the musical by what's his name, the story's loads better. So go and listen to both of those, but not until you've listened to me drone on about Robert Louis Stevenson and The Body Snatcher. I don't know if you know this, but I do spend some time putting together quite extensive notes, sometimes more extensive than others. And if you look in the show notes, you'll see a link to that. And I've done I'm looking at it now, and I think the artwork on it's really nice. And it's all set out for you there. So here we have it. So I say something about the author. I don't presume that you know anything about him, even though you may. And those of you who do, please bear with me. So Robert Louis Stevenson was a renowned Scottish author, essayist and poet born on November 13th, 1850 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He died in Samoa, very famously. He's moved his families. He wrote a book about the South Seas as well, and travelled around there, but I think it made him ill and killed him, basically. 1894, so he was not an old man by the time he died. I think that just makes it 44. So he was born into a family of lighthouse engineers, and when I was looking through some of his collected works on the Internet Archive, which is a great resource, he dedicated... There's a third volume, I think maybe all the volumes, I was looking at the third volume of his collected works, to his father, which I thought was rather nice, who, he said something really nice being a writer about, which I can't remember exactly now, which was about how so many lights burn bright because of his father, particularly lighthouses, which kept a lot of people alive. Unless you're anti-lighthouse, there may be some conspiracy theory about lighthouses, I don't know. This is what you find these days. You say something which you think is a universally accepted comment, and somebody goes, oh yeah, you're with them, are you? Big lighthouse. Maybe I am. Anyway, getting to the point. So he was always ill, and particularly respiratory issues, and he was confined to bed, where he developed his imagination and honed his storytelling skills. I think he's an excellent prose writer. Some people, Cormac McCarthy, Vladimir Nabokov, one of those, and many others, Graham Greene to an extent, not actually. I'll think of some more prose stylists when I come to it, but they spend a lot of time kind of writing nice, and their language is. John Banville is another one, and I'm just going to keep popping prose stylists out on you now. Raymond Chandler, of course, yeah, but Stevenson is. He does but he doesn't go over the top. He engages in, I wouldn't say purple prose, it may be getting a tinge bluish. I've got to admit now that I'm colourblind, so that blue and purple to me just seem the same colour. And I've told Sheila many times that both blue and green and blue and purple and red and green and orange and red are the same colour. And you're just winding me up when you say they're different. Shades of the same colour, but they're not different colours. Apparently I don't have the cone for green at all in my eye. I've never missed it, really. Well, that isn't true, but anyway, let's not get onto that. So I'm digressing far more than I anticipated, even as early as this. So all I was saying is I think he's not even workman-like. He's a great professional. He writes a story and he uses as many words as he needs to convey it. And he doesn't just flourish for the sake of flourishing, but he does have flourishes, but they're always important to the story. We're going to step aside and say, why might a prose flourish be important to the story? Well, they're usually this the rhetorical device of enargia, which is to the Greeks and Romans talked about this, about how we have to put the reader in the scene. If the reader isn't in the scene, they're not with us. So we have to use description, and usually that's when you get the kind of lyrical passages. I think, a digression on a digression. I think that what people like stories for all sorts of reasons. They either fall in love with the characters in some way, like Sherlock Holmes. Not in love, but they become very interested in the characters as people. They either think a writer has a great perspicacity and observational skills and is able to talk about a character and portray a character and in some way reveal the reader's feelings that they didn't know anybody shared with them. Yeah, do you see what I'm saying? So they may portray a character and this character is feeling this. And the reader, if the writer's very good, the reader will go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize anybody else felt like that. And there will be this bridge, this non-verbal bridge. So that's why. And then they like Oscar Wilde's aphorisms because he seems very clever. He's a great descriptive writer as well. So there are lots of reasons why people like stories. And they're probably, you could write a many-volumed book about this, so I won't do it, and I'm going to pull back and talk about Stevenson. I was just kind of saying what a good guy he is. He wrote Treasure Island, of course, great story. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, fantastic. Kidnapped, didn't like that so much, which showcased his talent for adventure, psychological depth, and vivid characterization. What was I just saying? His writing career took him far from his Scottish roots, and he travelled extensively in Europe and eventually, and America actually, settled in Samoa, where he became known as Tusitala. I don't know if I've said that right. The Teller of Tales. So his work explores themes of duality, clearly, morality and complexity of human nature, reflecting both his Scottish Calvinist background and more bohemian adult life. I like the way that is, he's got his artist who travels the world with his family, being very, very, very bohemian. And clearly he comes from a kind of ordinary working, not working class particularly, but working for a living family. And I don't know if you know Scotland, but particularly, I think east of Scotland, and Edinburgh prides itself for this no nonsense. The Scots in general pride themselves for the no nonsense. I think when you get to the west of Scotland, they're a bit more flamboyant, in the Highlands as well. But the Scots, and I said this with great love, and I think they would agree, pride themselves as being no nonsense. They know what life's about, and it can be quite grim, and so they make the best of it in a very efficient way. Scots produce engineers and very analytical philosophers. David Hume, fantastic philosopher. Adam Smith, people like that. There we are. So that is Robert Louis Stevenson in a nutshell. Not said much about Robert Louis. He said a lot of things about a lot of things. Let's talk about The Body Snatcher, published 1884. So it was published in the Pall Mall Gazette on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1884. Now, they must have realised it was a big story. And remember, there is this tradition of macabre ghost stories, but macabre stories at Christmas. Dickens did a lot of that, but of course M.R. James as well. And the Pall Mall Gazette was a prominent London evening newspaper of the time. So this is... he's already arrived, when this gets out. So it was 1884 and he was born in 1850, so he's only 34. He didn't even write it. It was written 3 years earlier in 1881 when he was staying in Pitlochry, and I'm going to be going through there in a couple of weeks. And we may stop for a sandwich. Last time I was there, absolutely poured down. anyway, the 3-year gap between writing The Body Snatcher and publication may be due to reservations by Stevenson or his wife Fanny. You can see why, though, can't you? So it's a chilling Gothic tale. We'll talk about Gothic in a minute. Inspired by Edinburgh urban legends, explores themes of morality, guilt, and the dark side of medical progress. Funnily enough, as part of my research for this, I read an article by a guy who I think it was something in. He cites the Lancet. It was either on the British Medical Journal or something like that, and they were talking about the ethics of. And although this is fiction, it's based on a real man, Dr. Robert Knox, who absolutely had popular anatomy classes and constant need for cadavers for dissection, and he paid the famous Burke and Hare, the Irish body snatchers who operated in Edinburgh. And of course, kind of Stevenson nods at them by having the people selling him the corpses, Fettes the corpse. Fettes is a famous school. Tony Blair went there, I think. And I think that's just an Edinburgh name he's pulled out. Yeah, they're Irish, and they were. And of course, that's another personal thing. My dad was from Edinburgh, and his mother was proper Scottish Presbyterian, my grandmother, who I never met, from Perth, or Perthshire anyway, just outside Perth. But my grandfather, who she married, was an Irish Catholic. So, and they lived in the Cowgate and Canongate and round there. And so that, when I did a bit of genealogy, and they're really in the Irish immigrant community area there. And Edinburgh, like Glasgow, of course, but Edinburgh as well, went on to found the Hibernian Football Club. Who, of course, all my dad's family support, so yeah, they were poor. In fact, I think my great grandfather's on one of the censuses, his occupation is scavenger, so he's like a rag and bone man, as far as I can tell. Anyway, so it's very much rooted in the dark history of early 19th century Edinburgh, particularly its medical community. And we alluded to the medical ethics of that. Medicine's kind of driven, well, again, this is a multi-volume and not anthology tome, but, and I've, of course, spent the last 20 years working in the health service. So, my dad was a doctor. So, there is this ambition and this progress that's driven in the same way as science, and this hunger to know. And then there's the other side of it, which is the so-called bedside manner, which is the compassion. And when I used to do training teach medical students things about mental health, they'd come and see me and spend days with me. And some of them were interested, and some of them couldn't see the point in it at all. And that, for me, typified the two kinds of doctors. Some are technocrats, and they just see it as a technical exercise. Maybe just see it is unfair, but I think most doctors tend to go one way or the other. They are, and GPs tend to be more on the pastoral side. Surgeons tend to be more, and I've met some great, I met some rotten, I don't mean rotten technically, I mean arrogant, insufferable. The people in training used to give me the hardest time with the surgeons and the midwives. They're both very opinionated and think they know everything. And they don't. And anyway, so, and it is time and time again in history, we've seen medical professionals transgress and step over ethics in pursuit of what they perhaps arrogantly would say, because there's a lot of arrogance in this profession. In fact, I'm going to tell you another story. I don't know if you know, there's a guy called John Campbell. John Campbell has a very popular YouTube channel. He talks about medical issues, and he taught me at one point. And I remember him saying to me, we were talking about personality disorders, and he said, we talked about the different kinds, and he said, the narcissistic personality disorder you will find far more commonly in your colleagues than your patients. Yeah, that's true. So I think we've seen time and time again, and we see it here, and Louis Stevenson actually really spotlights it. It's such a brilliant story for that cycle, for that ethical dimension. But if it was just the ethics, oh yes, I've done something bad, I'm really sorry, or I don't think it's bad. which is Wolf McFarlane's view, really. But Fettes and dither dathers, he has a conscience. But of course, where does conscience come from? Is conscience about some kind, and I think people do have this, whistleblowers, I was reading an article about whistleblowers, they tend to be driven by their internal moral code. They do things, they do what they consider, what their code tells them is right, for better or for worse, and often ruin their lives by being honest and speaking out. No names named. But many people, many of us perhaps, we do the right thing for fear of being punished. And I think Fettes is that man. And when he thinks he isn't going to be punished, he becomes all very full of himself, doesn't he? And jingling his money. And of course, that is, and perhaps Stevenson at that point, maybe he's laying a little red herring to make us suspect, if we're reading this for the first time, that he's going to get his comeuppance legally. Pride comes before a fall, and that's why. But that isn't really strongly developed. I mean, this is really Gothic, isn't it? And we talked about Birkenhead. The other real case that the story is based on was, Jane Galbraith, who he recognises, is an actual case of Mary Patterson, whose body was sold to Dr. Knox by Birkenhead in 1828. So such events contributed to the passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which increased the legal supply of cadavers for dissection and reduced the demand for illegally obtained bodies. Again, body snatchers are such a fascinating subject. They would families would sit and wait. Edinburgh, it was a real problem in Edinburgh, which was a famous surgical centre. Medical centre, but surgical as well. So so it was a big deal, and they used to put guards on, and they used to put mort safes, heavy iron cages placed over graves to deter body snatchers. This is probably why they end up going to the rural village of Glencorse, just outside Peebles, as far as I can tell. I think it's a real place. Yeah, I think he uses real places throughout. I mean, of course, Birkenhead, if you don't know, they were body snatchers, but they actually, the supply didn't meet the demand, so they started killing people, and they killed about at least 16 people and then sold the bodies on. So it's all based on the truth. Okay. So funnily enough, I'm in Carlisle, and Carlisle's about 100 miles south of Edinburgh. And there's a case from the early 18th century at St Cuthbert's graveyard here, and it said that there was some Scotchmen. I mean, we're right on the border, so Carlisle's, full of Scottish people, but these were particularly shifty ones. They weren't named as Irish. Maybe if you'd have named as that, but also there were lots of Irish there at the time. But anyway, these people came to suspicion of the authorities, and they, I think, it was somewhere like Peebles. It wouldn't be a coffin, but a wooden box that they were shipping the bodies up to Edinburgh to sell. It was that profitable. Came open at a posting house. Apparently they didn't go with the body themselves. They just kind of posted it on, and it came open, and they were discovered, and they'd taken a house down out of the city centre by the Eden, and they were nabbed. And that's a true story. There are details. I mean, I haven't got the details at my fingers. So let's think about Gothic. Could we just have a think about the Gothic tale? Gothic literature, which was very popular, it comes and goes in waves, doesn't it? It starts in the late 1700s, but certainly 1884. And we have his classic tale, Jekyll and Hyde, also very Gothic. And then we have 1894, I think, top of my head. We have Dracula. We've had Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Sheridan Le Fanu was a really popular author. What we don't know, looking back from our position now, is it's like I was reading J.B. Priestley. I was reading some of his stuff the other day. And at one point in the 50s and before, J.B. Priestley was everywhere, and now he's pretty much forgotten. And Le Fanu, we don't know how popular he was, but he would have been a household name. So Carmilla, so the Gothic was very much, there. So, and it says that the setting often takes on a character-like role, becoming an integral part of the story's atmosphere. Well, I think certainly the graveyard at the end is that. There is no naive young maiden, which is very classic. Or an older woman may appear as an aid to evil, or a clergyman might be portrayed as weak or corrupted. We don't have that, but what we do have is the doctor being corrupted. So perhaps it's that. Misery, mystery, and fear of the unknown are central themes of Gothic fiction. Tick, 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 with plots often revolving around shocking and melodramatic events. Tick, tick, that defy explanation. Well, they do at the end. Omens and portents of doom are common. Didn't get that. Its unique blend of deep passions and chilling dread. It often unfolds in grand, decaying architectural settings such as medieval castles, English manors. Well, Edinburgh itself is that. You know, the old town. When you go up Cockburn Street and you look at the tenements up there, it's Gothic on a stick. So very, very handsome city. So is the Body Snatcher Gothic? Yeah, it's got the atmosphere. It's got the rain. Oh yeah, rain. Bad weather is very Gothic. Usually thunderstorms, but rain will do. Snow will do sometimes, but isolated locations in bad weather, yes. Realistic horrors. A bit of body horror almost. We don't give the graphic details, but you know it's not uncommon to have a bit of body horror, and growing guilt, lots of guilt, and this is what we have. And it's kind of framed, which I haven't said, of course. The story is framed, although the back end of the frame is lost. It's more an introduction in this mythical English village of Debenham, where Fettes, we presume, has gone to escape his guilty conscience. I mean, the money given to him by Wolf McFarlane, he threw in the gutter. Wish I had been now to picked it up. Oh no, what does that say about me morally? No, I would have left it there in the rain. So he, Wolf McFarlane, clearly is affable still. He's pleased to see him, but that is never resolved. That, and often another issue of the Gothic is there is no happy ending, and that's characteristic of horror stories, as opposed to kind of ghost stories. In many ghost stories, they just wind up and the hero is either better off or usually no worse off. But with a horror story, usually the protagonist is worse off. And there is no happy ending to this. He is left with his bad conscience, and nothing can alleviate it or ameliorate it. Okay. So in the notes, which I've done, if you're interested in grave robbing, I recommend you listen to The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft, which I've done. Another story which doesn't get a lot of love, massively Gothic in the way that only Lovecraft can do. And then there's another one which is interesting. It's Tego Kane and the Corpse, which is an Irish story. Slightly different, but it does involve a corpse and burying a corpse. So I thought you might like those. I'm on holiday, you know, so if I miss a week, don't worry too much. I'll be back.
Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?